Call them eccentrics, quacks, weirdos, public characters, or even local originals. All nations have their peculiarities, or peculiar characters. In Spain, this is called cosas de España, the things of Spain, a term for all the oddities, faults, anomalies, and abuses considered to be inherent to Spain. A French saying runs something similar. The Emperor of Germany is the King of Kings, the King of Spain is the King of Men, the King of France, the King of Asses, and the King of England, the King of Devils. The American author, Ralph Waldo Emerson, said in 1856 on a trip to England, "I find the Englishman to be him of all men who stands firmest in his shoes. Those who stand by their convictions, no matter what, for better or worse." In England and the United States, this is usually called eccentricity. There lived a man named Job Orton in Kidderminster, England, who had his coffin built before he died. He used it as a wine bin while he lived. He was not one to waste money, so he just stored his wine in it. A Diogenes of the 1800s with his wine storage. When Mr. Orton finally passed, supposedly, he was buried sitting up, apparently under the theory that he should rise before his wife at the second coming. Mr. Orton was unremarkable beside for his odd pretensions, his eccentricity. This is why he's remembered at all. He was marked down as a curiosity in newspapers and later books. Eccentricity filled books in Victorian England. Authors made collections out of local oddities, customs, and curious originals. This has been retroactively called eccentric biography, the purview of a few authors interested in the gossip of the bizarre, grotesque, or just the weirdly charming. These categories included giants, dwarves, witches, madmen, heretics, the fat, and, of course, the socially awkward. The now forgotten American lecturer, Edwin Percy Whipple, said of those authors, and really of all authors, that they consigned to posterity some dunce with the immortality of contempt. There were those like John Mad Jack Minton of the late 1700s, a rake if there ever was one, a wealthy wastrel who burned his family fortune on drinking and gambling in only 18 years. Minton was also famous for lighting himself on fire in his nightshirt, supposedly to drive away hiccups. He was only saved because 2 other people were nearby at that time. Those hiccups he had acquired from drinking and hunting. Minton had a unique fox hunting habit, you see. He was reputed to go hunting shirtless in the winter. In the summer, occasionally, supposedly, he went shooting on horseback, nude. He also served a brief stint as a member of Parliament. Truly contemptible. The eccentric were/are not always contemptible, but they are, memorable in certain ways. That's why they're remembered to history, because they were just a certain way. Eccentric biography, as it is termed today, was often more gossip and hearsay than it was fact and history. Its subjects, who were not always people, were not really remarkable outside their curiosity and strangeness. That's what made people notice them. These urban catalogs of oddballs grew out of town gossip or town talk, which circulated usually through newspapers. Entire sections in newspapers, usually the notes and queries sections, were dedicated to such local color and rumors. A menagerie of miscellaneous notes which were collected into small and freely circulated biographies. Authors and reporters copied from each other with little care of authorship, attribution, or even legitimacy. A good story was a good story to be told. That though does mean things sometimes got a little exaggerated and possibly, well, outright wrong. These collections grew out of the literary backbone of anecdote books from the 1600s. These anecdote books were not an official or even recognized genre, but a heterogeneous collection of easy reading sourced from folklore, tall tales, biographies, diaries, religious books, and even farming manuals, usually English, French, or Latin for the educated. One of the first was Nathaniel Wanley's amply titled The Wonders of the Little World, or A General History of Man in 6 Books, wherein by many thousands of examples is shewed what man hath been from the first ages of the world to these times, in respect of his body, senses, passions, affections, his virtues and perfections, his vices and defects, his quality, vocation, and professions, and many other particulars not reducible to any of the former heads. 1673. The ornate apex of this pseudo-genre was Robert Chambers' The Book of Days in 1864. His Book of Days was stuffed full of decadent illustrations which reflected its full title, The Book of Days, a miscellany of popular antiquities in connection with the calendar, including anecdote, biography, and history, curiosities of literature, and oddities of human life and character. The book, a massive compendium, usually sold in several volumes, of lore and trivia related to each month and day of the year. Yes, literally every day of the year. You can look up something for, say, September 23rd. It was exhausting for Chambers to write, but he had a plentiful tradition of history, curiosities, and anecdotes to borrow from to fuel the book. This public commons of anecdotes and stories, usually sourced from biographies, would remain popular and be used by later writers. The first half of the 19th century had after all seen an explosion in sensational and eccentric literature. This had emerged out of a fad for biographical literature in the 18th century. As all the interesting and remarkable personalities of history were covered, biographers and gossipers looked towards more local and bizarre characters to focus on. G.H. Wilson had published The Eccentric Mirror, reflecting a faithful and interesting delineation of male and female characters, ancient and modern, collected and recollected from the most authentic sources in 1807. This would more or less set the pace for this entire genre. There was James Caulfield's and engraver George Smeaton's Eccentric Magazine, which was later compiled as The Eccentric Magazine, or Lives and Portraits of Remarkable Persons, in 1812, one of the more popular books due to its illustrations. A copy was even found in George III's library, though it is unknown if the king ever actually read it. Maybe he just looked at the pictures. All these books were basically what their titles described: anecdotes, diatribes, and maybe fake, maybe real stories, freely collected from the public and the author's own libraries. They mostly focused on England, Scotland, and Ireland, but there were sections that focused on wider European affairs, and even, occasionally, American oddities, like Mormonism. The high watermark of this genre, though, was John Timm's English Eccentrics and Eccentricities in 1866. It was not too dissimilar from Chambers' Book of Days. Unlike the Book of Days, though, Timm's book, originally published in 2 volumes, was interested mainly in strange people, odd traditions, and strange turns of phrase. Each was given a small space of description. It featured somewhat grotesque illustrations of its subjects as well. Timm's took facts and stories freely from earlier volumes like Wilson's and Caulfield's. As was the scientific bend of the era, Timm's attempted to develop a classification of its subjects. What was normal and what was not normal. The list ran: wealth and fashion, delusions, impostures and fanatic missions, hermits, fat people, giants, dwarves and strong men, strong sights and sporting scenes, eccentric travelers, artists and theatrical people, men of letters, and convivial eccentricities. Who were the subjects of Timm's sometimes sincere, sometimes grotesque capsule biographies? Well, painter John Thomas Smith remarked about London in 1818 that there was plenty of material to write about. It is scarcely possible for any person possessing the smallest share of common observation to pass through the streets in London without noticing what is generally denominated a character, either in dress, walk, pursuits, or propensities. There was William Beckford, 1760 to 1844, the nouveau rich commoner who reflected all the worst character instincts of the 19th century rich. Today, Beckford is best known as the lush writer of the Gothic Oriental novel Vathek, 1782, a book he claimed to have written in 3 days and 2 nights, which left him sick from exhaustion. Beckford was as gaudy and Gothic as his literary work. He retained an Italian dwarf named Piero, who rode a show pony, as a companion. Beckford's great project was not his literary work, but his manner. Fonthill Abbey, from 1796 to 1813, Like any good Gothic novel and its author, the Abbey was maybe cursed by Beckford's outlandishness. Beckford paid the locals freely and widely to help construct his manor in Wiltshire, England, from 1796 to 1813, and the building was always under construction. The problem was the design was so extravagant and so hastily constructed, the faux abbey kept collapsing in on itself. One legend states the kitchen collapsed after Christmas dinner, the first and only dinner held in that incarnation of the kitchen. The main spire is famously said to have collapsed into dust, but no one was actually injured in the collapse. Due to this, the abbey was technically never finished as long as Beckford was building it, and unlike the foreman, he usually was the one there building it. It, or what remained of it by that point, was demolished in 1845, 1 year after Beckford had died in Bath. The abbey land long sewed off and fallen, only a slant few rooms left to remind the locals of what was. A sort of local and colorful legend now. Contemporaries swore Beckford was not a bad man, but he had been poisoned by his wealth, which he had inherited from his family in the New World. Others, like the dandy George Bryan Bew Brummel, 1778 to 1840, were poisoned more by taste rather than wealth exactly, though Brummel was wealthy. He can perhaps be blamed as the innovator of twee in England. He was a socialite notorious for his innovations in fashion in the late 1700s, and had a penchant for collecting snuff boxes, expensive snuff boxes. His fashion was exact, precise, and so highly regarded he dominated the court and high society. Special attention was paid to his ample cravat, which often required more fabric than his entire head, and was a ceremony to fold in the morning. He dominated society with his acidic commentary and mockery of those far less fashionable than him. Brummel was both widely praised and widely mocked in his time. He was infamously the target of one man's notorious ire, the later philosopher Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle legitimately despised the fop Brummel for representing the vapidness and vanity of the 1800s. Effect has not always followed causes it should have done. They have their Shakespeare and Philip Sidney, while we have our Sheridan Knowles and Bew Brummel. Then again, this was Carlyle, who was famous for being critical of, basically everything. Brummel's reign of aesthetic terror, though, ended when he fell out with George IV and was forced to flee to France to escape debtor's prison. He had, unsurprisingly, blown his entire fortune on fashion, tobacco and snuff, and also, the always fun, gambling. He died basically in obscurity, likely of syphilis, bemusingly one of the most controversial persons ever to draw attention in England. Other eccentrics like him were literally poisoned to death. Liars, cheaters, and defrauders. James Price, 1752 to 1783, was notorious for being one of the last scholars admitted to the Royal Society, the main scientific body of England, to take seriously the search for the Philosopher's Stone. In other words, a true and honest alchemist. In the 1780s, Price came to fame for the claim he had discovered a method to convert quicksilver, mercury, into gold and silver. He had, he claimed, solved the mystery of alchemy. He had affidavits by several other respectable men who had witnessed his successful experiments in the conversion process. It turned out later they were perhaps, maybe forged, or maybe outright lies. When he was called to present his experimental process before the Royal Society, Price continued to make excuses for himself. Doubt began to circulate about the legitimacy of James Price's chemical efforts. When a trio of scientists were finally deployed to Price's house, Price welcomed them to his residence and prepared his laboratory to showcase his abilities. Price then returned with an unannounced vial he swallowed in front of the guests. It was prussic acid, today better known as hydrogen cyanide. The compound had killed him before any of the visitors could reach him to resuscitate him. The false alchemist had committed suicide rather than lose face in the front of his scientific peers. One should always remember the warning Tim sets out within the book. Eccentricity has its badge and characteristics by which it gains distinction and notoriety, and which in some cases serve as a lure to real excellence. More familiar figures did not escape commentary or observation from Tim's, though. Remarks were made on eccentric authors and artists, such as essayist Samuel Johnson, known for his dictionary, and poet-engraver William Blake, known for his poetic cycles. Johnson, then known as the Great Convulsionary, for his habits of odd gestures or spasms, incessant repetition of words or phrases like the Lord's Prayer to himself, or his persistent bouts of melancholy. Timms does notice, which may be surprising to modern readers, Johnson's maladjustments were likely the result of mental issues, now thought to particularly be Tourette's syndrome. Timms records one story that Johnson, usually when reading, would hear his name called by his mother when she was not there, an auditory hallucination, suggesting Timms knew there were certain peculiarities of the mind which made people eccentric, rather than those who were simply eccentric. Then Timms' remarks on William Blake come in the middle of the poet's transformation from eccentric to visionary in public literary reputation, an interesting point in the reclamation of Blake's reputation as a writer. Wordsworth was more interested with what he terms Blake's madness than with the sanity of Lord Byron and Walter Scott. Timms points to Alexander Gilchrist's, then soon-to-be famous biography of Blake, Life of William Blake. Timms, though fascinated with Blake's boundless imagination, his effort to draw ghost portraits of legendary figures like Moses, Virgil, Dante, and even Blake's long quest to draw an adequate portrait of Satan, a quest which took over a decade, and Blake did accomplish, but by the end, left him somewhat horrified. Though lesser known today, the sculptor Joseph Nollekens also drew similar attention for his peculiar personality. It was his quirks people found more fascinating than his actual work, his statues. Nollekens famously would insult men and women who sat for the statues they commissioned from him. He once told a lady with a squint to turn her head so he might banish the shyness from her eyes. And when a lady of high society twitched while sitting, he told her to not be so scorny as to not ruin the bust. He took his creation very seriously. Nollekens, while talented in the arts, was also a notorious cheapskate. His wife, too. This was very publicly known even during their lives. Miss Nollekens pinched free nutmeg and cloves from the grocer for free samples, while Mr. Nollekens filled his own pockets by dropping cloves and other things beneath others' dinner tables to pocket them, usually at high society engagements. One of Nollekens' more humorous incidents is the perhaps apocryphal, perhaps real, story of the guest and the fire. One day, Nollekens had a fellow artist staying at his house to make a drawing of a monument, the day and night terribly cold, as it was England, especially in the guest room. Nollekens entered the room to say, "I'm afraid you're cold here." The friend replied, "I am indeed." "Aye," replied Nollekens, "I don't wonder at it. Why, do you know there has not been a fire in this room for these 40 years? Doubtless to say, there was no fire in the room that night. Nollekens had no interest in spending any extra cash on firewood. English Eccentrics and Eccentricities was full of characters with unique preoccupations and fears. Peter Wolfe, 1727 to 1803, was another erratic scientist, Anglo-Irish, of some renown in 18th century Ireland, though he lived mostly in London and Paris. He was a chemist, and his name sometimes still appears in chemistry books. The Wolfe bottle, for example. Wolfe's contemporaries, though, regretted there was no complete memoir of both his brilliance and his oddities. Wolfe was a successful chemist and geologist, but, like James Price, retained a fascination with medieval alchemy. Wolfe's schedule was notoriously erratic, and his days started with breakfast at 4 o'clock. Friends, and only friends, could only gain admittance to Wolfe's house by a secret code, a certain series of knocks at his front door. Visitors, though, found little space to actually visit with Wolfe. His quarters were packed with furnaces, tubes, boxes, and parcels, all used for his alchemical endeavors. Friends would put their hats down and instantly lose them in the mess of scientific projects. If Wolfe felt offended by a visitor, when he had the rare visitor, he would send the offender a gift, then never speak to them again. Wolfe believed the best entertainment, and cure for illness apparently, was to take a carriage from London to Edinburgh, then back again, basically with no stops. The exhaustion from these trips eventually killed him in 1803 when a cold grew out of control. He died alone, refusing medical care or sincere companionship in his last hours. His friends were much disappointed. A similar fate would befall the equally notable scientist. Interesting to note, many of these individuals have been scientists and chemists. Wonder if Mercury has anything to do with that. The Honorable Henry Cavendish, 1731 to 1810, better known in his own time as a woman-hating savant. Cavendish was an incredibly successful scientist, remembered best for his measurements of the Earth, but he was also known for being cripplingly awkward. Cavendish had issues talking to more than one person at a time. He did not even like to talk to one person at a time. He would avoid strangers as conversation pained him. When requested by an Austrian gentleman to attend a soiree, Cavendish stood there at the party, eyes downcast and in misery, talking to no one. Then, without a word once he saw a chance, he ran out the door to take his carriage straight home. He had difficulty interacting in public, awkwardness in speech, and would often flee at any request, no matter how sincere or simple. Women, though, were often Cavendish's main subject of avoidance. He was disgusted by any talk of woman or love among his scientific peers. He would only communicate with his housekeeper through notes on his hall table. If he caught sight of his female housekeeper, Cavendish would fire her on the spot, which he did at least once. If any woman attempted to catch a glimpse of the illustrious philosopher, Cavendish would go out of his way to avoid that path in the future. Cavendish does not seem to have been a true misogynist, though. He did not go out of his way to badmouth or insult women. There was also one case where Cavendish risked bodily harm to save a woman from a rampaging mad cow. He, though, quickly avoided her afterwards. If unbothered, Cavendish was described as punctiously regular and trustworthy. Always did he hang his hat upon the same peg, always did he walk the same path. These certain obsessive habits are not anything new. Cavendish's regular outfit of 1800 would have been more in style in 1760. Most of the attention given to Cavendish in public was due to his scholarly reputation and dress, rather than his sheer awkwardness alone. It was later remarked by Cavendish's peers, the best way to keep him around was, "The way to talk to Cavendish is never to look at him, but to talk as if it were into a vacancy, and then it is not unlikely you may set him going." Local characters colored literature beyond eccentric compilations like Tim's and others, though. There was an entire populace full of eccentrics whose names were never put to history. They remain nameless, and they are simply those that wandered the streets of London and received scant mention, perhaps a reference in a newspaper here and there. Charles Dickens was no stranger to these bizarre characters and his reporting. Even his fiction drew on them. The walking city, London, presented common encounters with endless public oddities. Dickens' penchant for night and early morning walks meant, exaggerated or not, he would report his encounters with these people from 1859 to 1861, the peak of interest in eccentricity and what haunted the streets of London. He was often slightly disturbed by these characters. The one that seems to have stuck with him the most, though, was the encounter with the nameless Pudding Man, a spectral character of the dawn, a true oddity. The video then will conclude here with Dickens' direct account of this nameless character. We have only Dickens' mention of him, yet he stands out as one of the most colorful and bizarre characters to ever cross the written page. The following comes from Dickens' The Uncommercial Traveller, which was based on his earlier reporting. "There came one morning as I sat over my houseless cup, pondering where to go next, a man in a high and long snuff-coloured coat and shoes, and, to the best of my belief, nothing else but a hat, who took out of his hat a large cold meat pudding, a meat pudding so large that it was a tight fit, and brought the lining of the hat out with it. This mysterious man was known by his pudding, for, on his entering, the man of sleep brought him a pint of hot tea, a small loaf, and a large knife and fork, and plate. Left to himself in his box, he stood the pudding on the bare table, and, instead of cutting it, stabbed it overhand with the knife like a mortal enemy, then took the knife out, wiped it on his sleeve, tore the pudding asunder with his fingers, and ate it all up. The remembrance of this man with the pudding remains with me as the remembrance of the most spectral person my houselessness encountered. Twice only was I in that establishment, and twice I saw him stalk in, as I should say, just out of bed, and presently going back to bed, take out his pudding, stab his pudding, wipe the dagger, and eat his pudding all up. He was a man whose figure promised cadaverousness, who had an excessively red face, though shaped like a horse's. On the second occasion of my seeing him, he said huskily to the man of sleep, 'Am I red tonight?' 'You are,' he uncompromisingly answered. 'My mother,' said the spectre, was a red-faced woman that loved to drink, and I looked at her hard when she laid in her coffin, and I took the complexion. Somehow, the pudding seemed an unwholesome pudding after that, and I put myself in its way no more. One man's unwholesome pudding is another man's notable, nameless eccentric of the night, a true original nearly lost to history.
Would like to give an eccentric thank you to my supporters. Moving right on, I am an anonymous patron.